I do a guide to very unusual, unique, oddball hotels in the United States. So if anyone knows of any real oddball hotels, write me about them. Um,
They're all
but
in California.
ultimately, I see wanting to get into art and artist postcards. I could work on right now because postcards are so simple. I want to do calendars, but calendars are so expensive to do. I've investigated, and it's terribly, terribly expensive. I want to do artist books, like books of like the series that you did, or the series that Louise Rudloff did of working through your a life journey kind of books. I'd like to do books like that, and she wants to do books of poetry and writing and children's books and things. And I can see how you can connect artists for that. You can connect the visual artist with the writer to do a children's book. But a lot of it's far away. Right now, I'm only going to do the books I've already done and know how to do. But if people have publishing ideas, especially if they have publishing ideas that they think are real feasible right now, anyone who hasn't, let me know, because I seem to be pushed into this direction that I actually am not really. I'd really much rather just make sculpture. I don't really want to publish a book, but I feel like God keeps publishing me, pushing me into the direction.
I keep publishing you.
That I'm stuck in here for a while.
Lorena, Iris Madden was telling me that CDT is the concept of creating hotels.
Did you hear about the hotel in Oregon that has each room is like an Edgar Allan Poe
Mystery
room?
one. I already have that one down. Someone in Oregon sent me who knows I want to do this, sent me a whole package of.
Yeah, there's also an Edmund.
I guess the first thing would be just if you could say your name and give a little bit of background, maybe how long you've been in Subud, how you came to it.
Well, I'm Rachman Mictchell, and I was at Coombe Springs when Bapak first came to England, and I first heard about Bapak from John Bennett, and in one of his morning groups for young people, and he said there was someone coming from the east who would alter, change the direction of our work, as it was called. Work for oneself was the name of the Goethe system. And at that time I didn't know that Bennett himself had been following latihan for 4 or 5 months himself, together with 2 or 3 other people in Goethe. And at the same time he had been doing a sort of morning relaxation exercise with a number of us in Coombe Springs. And about 2 or 3 nights after 2 or 3 days later, after he'd spoken to us about this, I was suddenly awakened at about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. And not just kind of like waking up, but really awake inside, in a way I never felt woken before. And I didn't open my eyes. And I suddenly became aware of a very bright light that seemed to be kind of open over the open window just above there. I was sleeping in a room that faced on the garden. It was a simple kind of little cottage. And I was aware of this light, and then suddenly the light kind of entered into my head and then moved into my body and was accompanied by a very deep feeling of joy and bliss. And I heard my own voice speaking to me and saying that I should follow the one who was coming, who'd been spoken about, and should try and follow his advice and so on. And I don't know how long the experience was, but then it went. didn't tell anyone about this experience at all. My life was in some confusion at that time. I'd fallen in love with a girl and I couldn't, she was far away and I couldn't visit her, and had my exams to take. A lot of things had kind of, after that, had fallen in love with someone who was married. And life was very, sort of somewhat confusing. Anyhow, 6 weeks later, Papa came to Coombe Springs, and I was appointed to be one of the waiters to wait on supper for his family. There was Ismana and Rahayu and some others as well. And shortly after that, I was opened. And for me, one of the proofs, of course, of the latihan at that time was within a short time, I'd fallen out of love with this married woman, who was married to a friend of mine. And that was one of the things. Just suddenly, I looked at her, and she looked at me, and bang! Everything was clear. The second thing that was a kind of proof to me of the latihan was that since the age of 12, when my father died, there had remained a kind of black mass in me of sadness and depression. And at that, sometime after this experience and after I was open, I was suddenly aware of my father just sitting beside me. And it was absolutely clear that the reality of his being was there. So all my doubts as about the reality of the next world was kind of was put to rest. The third thing that happened was that my dependence on John Bennett as a teacher suddenly just completely went. And I think this may have been about 6 months after it was open. Just remember that in the Gurdjieff work, your teacher was someone who required the utmost obedience and respect from one. And John Bennett was speaking at one of these meetings and saying that we must remember all the truth, what we'd learned in the past, and how it's important to continue the work on ourselves in the way we've been taught before. And I found something spontaneously happening in me that I could hardly prevent, a sort of voice welling up in me and saying, no, it's not like that anymore. We must simply just follow what we've received now. So that was something strange for me, because I had revered him and respected him. And for me to say that was altogether quite extraordinary. Possibly the fourth thing that I noticed was that something that I had been longing for in my adolescence and in my early 20s was to be able to experience life fresh again, like as a child, like as a as one experience this immediacy of life, particularly to smell, to hear, to feel, to see in the same way. And that did actually, that happened. And I must say a lot of sort of the sexual problems of adolescence also seem to really settle themselves in that extraordinary year when Bapak came and lived one. There was a calmness and inner satisfaction. It was altogether quite extraordinary. And finally, I suppose the other interesting thing was that in my medical studies, I no longer wanted to follow kind of occult ways of medicine, or any occultism at all. Books on Rudolf Steiner, books on all kinds of occult ways of looking at medicine just went out of the window. I didn't want to read them. And really all I wanted to do was to qualify and be a practical doctor. So a lot of things kind of sorted themselves out for me in this sort of first 3 years. There's an interesting thing. I mean, talking about sex again. Most young people need to have some way of relieving their sexual tensions and so on. And I don't know how it was for other young people, but what happened to me simply was after every latihan at night, there would be a wet dream. And one sort of grew completely used to this. It was just there was no need to relieve sexual tension in another way. Bapak stayed up in the west wing of Coombe Springs, and there were many people open there. I guess it was in June of that year, 57, May or June that I was opened. I think it must have been May the 27th.
What year, 57?
57. And many people came. There was going to be a seminar for the Gurdjieff method, and many people were coming from all over the world. And Bennett was really excellent at this point in time in getting people to come into Subud. And there wasn't enough space in the dining room. And so in the garden at Coombe Springs, quite a big garden, they put up 3 big wooden sheds for latihan. And it's interesting, I think the building that we were making called the Jami Tunatra, which was a 7-sided building, had possibly not been completed at that time. I think that's why they had to put these buildings there. And there was, every evening, there's probably several hundred of people who had to do their latihan. And the racket, the noise, was utterly indescribable. It seemed that these floors acted as a kind of sounding board. And Bapak placed the most active, called them O group. And people not only were sort of vibrating the boards, but people were going through the windows. Practically a window was broken every night. Some people seemed to roll up in the carpets and roll out the doors. it was quite an extraordinary thing. Then Bapak left, and he left behind an Indonesian from Sumatra called Shafruddin, whom I felt very close to, and another called Asikin, who was younger than him. Shaf was really his representative. And things then began to be a little difficult because Bennett lost his faith was beginning to lose his faith in the completeness of guidance in the latihan. He couldn't give up his role as a teacher. And Shafruddin felt equally certain that this couldn't be mixed with Subud. So there grew to be a little bit of a division at that point, and it was a sorting out of one from another. And I remember seeing Bennett and suggesting, well, maybe we should carve Coombe Springs in two. And Subud have one half and Gurdjieff method the other half. It was too simplistic to follow, I suppose. And of course it all ended up with him selling Coombe Springs in the end, starting off on his own.
This was a few years down the line.
Yes, it was a few years down there, but there seemed to be 1 year of what I would call almost paradise. It was Bapak and Ibu were living in Coombe Springs, people were coming. There was a change from the earnestness and what do you call it? Really, it's difficult to describe. The very earnest, serious attitude of the work from Gurdjieff and the efforts to observe yourself, to be conscious of yourself, the efforts to work on yourself, and the efforts to, in every way, be serious, compared to the feeling of lightness and joy and laughter that came into the place when Bapak came. In fact, some people, I never experienced this, but some people heard an enormous explosion one night, really big, almost like a clap of thunder when there was no thunder there. And Bapak heard it and said, this was actually the material forces actually meeting and kind of exploding in the place. Well then, I don't want to sort of go into all the sort of details of my life.
Give us the highlights or any special kinds of experiences that you've had.
Yeah. In a way, I suppose I've had presentiments of the future all my life. I spoke about my father, and one of the interesting things in this is my father died when I was 12, and I was on a visit to my aunts in Scotland. My aunts lived in the Highlands, in a place called Pitlochry. And I was just passing through Edinburgh and was looking in a shop window in Princess Street. And a little old lady came up to me and said, you don't know, the English prep school boy is a very shy and embarrassed kind of child. And she came up to me and said, believe in Almighty God. That is the most important thing in your life. And something will happen to you, but be sure to remember that. And 2 to 3 days later, the telegram arrived of my father's death. And I forgot all about it. I've told you what happened shortly after I was opened, and just one other experience that went with that. And I remember walking down one of the paths in Coombe Springs, and suddenly realizing that it was true that I possessed a soul or an inner self. And I remember just jumping up and down saying, "Eureka, Eureka, it's true," you know. Anyhow, another experience that happened a bit later now, going forward a few years, to about 1966, and I'd been qualified for about 5 or 6 years, and I'd sort of completed a phase of my training as a doctor. I'd done a lot of jobs in hospital. I'd got my higher degree in medicine, and I was wondering what to do next, and I had a dream, and in this dream I saw Bapak, and near a yellow taxi at the back of his house in Jalandhar. I'd been out there and seen him before this, but in the dream there was a circle of people whom I knew who were already out at Jalandhar, and they were around the car, and Bapak was putting his mother into this yellow taxi, and he was saying goodbye to her, and it was very kind of poignant goodbye. And he saw me and he beckoned to me to come through that crowd of people to help him put his mother into the car to say goodbye to her. And at that time I sort of interpreted the dream as my need to leave England and say goodbye to my own mother. You know, that's how I interpreted it. Well, anyhow, by a series of different incidents and so on, I came to live in Jalandhar, and slowly sort of built up a practice as a doctor for the expatriate community and for the British Embassy and so on. And Bapak began to ask me to see various members of his family. And one was his mother, came to stay at that time from Samurai. And she's a very independent lady, very straight-backed, tall lady who was very dignified. And I saw her a few things about her eyes, about her knees, and her arthritic knees. And I advised Bapak, I said, you know, maybe for a while it'd be better if she didn't do the solat, because she should rest her knees and not bend down, you know. And he said to her, well, Mother, you know, you could do your prayers sitting down. And she looked at him and said, you know, life's not worth living if you can't do the solat. So this is, and anyhow, the time came when she came to a serious illness. It was really a very serious illness. And she must have been, I don't know, into her 90s at that time, well, into her 90s. And Bapak was very keen for her to stay and not to go. And he asked me to help and treat her and so on. But it was clear that A, she didn't want to stay, she wanted to go. And B, she wasn't going to accede to my methods of treatment, putting drips up in her heart. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't take any medicine. She tore any drips out, put one And well, I tried all kinds of ways to sort of keep her nourishment up. But as I say, she was quite determined to fast. And suddenly one evening, we all seemed drawn to her bedside. That's all the family, all Bapak's family, and Sharif and Rahana, my wife and myself. And I've never seen someone die in such a dignified and such a peaceful way. She really seemed to hand herself over almost consciously. And it was a very, very, very moving experience. And as this happened, I remembered the dream. And that dream was almost 7 years before. And interestingly, that was the year in which yellow taxis came into Jakarta. And again, I feel, I don't know the significance of these dreams or how it is, it kind of like the dream life and the real life kind of intertwine. Dimension of time seems to have another dimension of eternity mixed in with it.
What was it like being Bapak's doctor?
Well, both wonderful and difficult at the same time. Wonderful in that one was that one could be of service to him was a great feeling of satisfaction. Even the smallest service filled one with a lot of satisfaction, because you felt that one had received not enormous amount from him, not only spiritually, but in his simple graciousness to see one was comfortable in a material way. Like I can tell you later about making sure that one was comfortable in the house, or seeing one was comfortable by having land up in the mountains to have a sort of weekend home. But coming back to being his doctor, one was also became privy to the way that he faced difficulties, bodily difficulties and so on. Papa always said that he